The orders came through at 0600 hours, stamped with clearance levels I'd only seen twice before in my 8 years with the unit. Capture, not kill. Target: Dr. Lee Wexler, former biochemist turned recluse. Last known location somewhere in the wilderness outside Fairbanks, Alaska. The briefing folder contained a single photograph of a gaunt man with wild gray hair and the kind of eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. Colonel Bryant handed me the file without his usual smirk. That should have been my first warning. Simple extraction, Thompson. Wexler's been off the grid for 5 years, but we've tracked him to a cabin about 60 miles northeast of Fairbanks. Bring him in alive. What's he wanted for? That's above your pay grade. David Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Any reason we need 4 guys for one old scientist? Bryant's expression didn't change. Wexler's unpredictable. Could be armed. Could be booby-trapped his place. I want you prepared for anything. James Wilson was already studying the satellite photos of Wexler's location. Remote doesn't begin to cover it. No roads within 10 miles, no cell coverage, no nothing. That's why he picked it, Christopher Lee said quietly. He'd been reading over the sparse intelligence report. Guy wants to stay lost. We flew out that afternoon on a military transport, then switched to a smaller helicopter for the final approach to Alaska. The landscape below us went on forever, all white, broken only by the dark lines of rivers and the occasional cluster of spruce trees. As we got closer to Wexler's coordinates, even those became sparse. The pilot set us down in a clearing about 2 miles from the target location. The cold hit me hard when I stepped out of the chopper, sharp enough to make my eyes water even through the tactical goggles. We'd trained in cold weather before, but this felt different. Heavier somehow. Radio check in 6 hours, I told the pilot. If you don't hear from us, report back to base. The hike to Wexler's cabin took us through terrain that seemed designed to break ankles. Fallen logs hidden under snow. Sudden drops where the ground gave way, and a silence so complete it made me want to check my earpiece every few minutes. David tried to crack a joke about frozen nose hairs, but even he gave up after the first mile. When we finally spotted the cabin, I knew something was wrong. The building itself looked solid enough. Log walls, metal roof, smokestack that should have been putting out a steady stream if anyone was home during an Alaskan winter. But no smoke rose from the chimney. No footprints marked the snow around the building. No lights showed through the windows. Looks empty, James whispered. I signaled for the team to spread out and approach from different angles. David took the back. Christopher moved to cover the side window. And James positioned himself with a clear view of the front door. I waited until everyone was in position before moving closer. The front door was unlocked. That hit me as wrong immediately. Nobody lives this far off the grid and leaves their door open, especially not someone trying to stay hidden. I pushed it open slowly, rifle ready, and stepped inside. The smell reached me first, not the decay I was expecting, but something else. Metallic and sharp, like copper pennies left in the sun. The main room of the cabin stretched before me, and I had to fight the urge to back out immediately. Lee Wexler hung from a rope attached to the main support beam. The noose was made from climbing rope, professionally tied, and his body swayed slightly in the draft from the open door. His face was purple and swollen, tongue protruding, but what made my stomach turn was the expression in his eyes. Even in death, they looked terrified. Jesus Christ, David's voice came from behind me as he entered the cabin. I forced myself to move closer and check for signs of life, though it was obvious Wexler had been dead for at least a day. His hands were cold and stiff, fingernails blue. No pulse, no breathing, no reaction to touch. Secure the perimeter, I ordered Christopher and James. David, help me process this scene. The cabin's interior looked like a tornado had hit it. Papers covered every surface. The floor, the dining table, taped to the walls. Most were covered in handwriting so dense and frantic it was barely readable. Star charts hung on the walls, marked with red ink in patterns that hurt to look at. Math problems filled notebook after notebook, the numbers becoming increasingly messy toward the end. But what made the hair on my neck stand up were the sketches. Dozens of them, scattered among the research papers. All showed the same subject: a tall, impossibly thin person with bright white eyes. The drawings got progressively darker and more detailed, as if Wexler had been getting better at remembering something he'd actually seen. In the most recent sketches, the person appeared to be reaching toward the viewer. David picked up one of the notebooks and flipped through it. This guy was seriously messed up. Look at this stuff. The journal entries started normal enough. Notes about star patterns, observations about space oddities. But as I read further, Wexler's handwriting became more frantic, his theories more desperate. He wrote about finding something in the space between star systems, something that moved without following any known laws of physics, an entity that had been traveling toward Earth for decades. Mike, David's voice was tight. You need to see this. He was staring at the wall next to Wexler's body. Written in what looked like dried blood, in letters almost 2 feet tall, was a message. It is here. The words seemed to move in my vision, and I had to look away. When I looked back at Wexler's body, I noticed his right hand was covered in blood, fingernails torn and ragged. He'd written that message himself, probably moments before putting the noose around his neck. Christopher's voice came through my earpiece. Movement in the trees, about 50 yards north. Probably just an animal, but thought you should know. I made a mental note to check later and kept searching the cabin. In what must have been Wexler's bedroom, I found more journals, these ones dating back 5 years. The entries started when he'd first arrived in Alaska, running from what he called academic persecution over his unconventional research. At first, Wexler had been excited about his isolation. The clear Alaskan skies gave him perfect conditions for his star watching. But somewhere around year 3, his entries took a darker turn. He began writing about objects that appeared in his telescope but disappeared when he tried to photograph them. Shadows that moved on their own. Equipment problems that happened at precise intervals. The final entries, dated just days ago, were almost impossible to read. Wexler wrote about something approaching Earth, something that had been watching him through his telescope. He believed it could sense when people looked at it, and that seeing it marked you somehow. The last clear sentence made my blood run cold. It knows I've seen it. It's coming for me now. James called in through the radio. Boss, you need to check out the back of the cabin. There's something weird here. I found him standing next to Wexler's telescope, a professional-grade instrument that must have cost more than most people's cars. The lens was cracked down the middle, spider webbing out from a central impact point. But what caught my attention was what the telescope was pointing at. Empty sky. Not toward any visible star or planet, just a patch of blackness between constellations. Was it like this when you found it? I asked. Yeah. And look at this. James showed me a logbook next to the telescope. Wexler had been tracking the same coordinates for months, noting the exact time and duration of his observations. The final entry was dated the day before we'd found his body. Final contact established. It sees me now. God forgive me for what I've done. David came out of the cabin carrying a box of Wexler's personal things. Found some more journals and what looks like letters with other scientists. Might be important. I called the team together to talk about our next move. We'd been ordered to bring Wexler in alive, but that option was off the table now. The scene clearly showed suicide, though the circumstances were weird enough to need investigation. We call it in as mission failure, I decided. Natural death, target eliminated himself before we could make contact. What about all this research stuff? Christopher asked, gesturing toward the cabin. Some of this looks pretty sensitive. We document everything, pack up what we can carry, and let the cleanup crew handle the rest. But as I stood there looking at Wexler's body and the bloody message on the wall, something felt fundamentally wrong about the whole situation. The silence around the cabin was too complete. No bird calls, no wind through the trees. Even the normal settling sounds a building makes in the cold were gone. The air itself seemed to press down on us, heavy with a bad feeling I couldn't explain. I was shoving the last of Wexler's journals into my pack when Christopher's voice crackled through the radio again. "Still got movement out there, boss. Whatever it is hasn't left." David looked up from the box of research materials he'd been securing. Could be a bear, or wolves. In this cold. James checked his weapon and moved toward the cabin door. Most animals would be holed up somewhere warm. I made the call we all knew was coming. We investigate before we leave. Can't have something tracking us back to the extraction point. The team fell into formation automatically. David and James would circle wide around the northern perimeter, while Christopher and I took a direct approach toward where he'd spotted the movement. Standard reconnaissance pattern, something we'd done hundreds of times before. But stepping outside the cabin felt different now. The heavy silence I'd noticed earlier had gotten worse, if that was possible. No wind stirred the pine branches overhead. No snow fell from the heavy gray clouds. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, like the forest itself was absorbing sound. "Radio check," I said into my mic. "Copy," came David's voice, though it sounded distant and tinged with static. "Same here," James replied, his transmission cutting in and out. Getting some interference, though. Christopher and I pushed into the tree line, following the faint depressions in the snow that might have been tracks. The forest closed around us quickly, branches so thick they blocked most of the pale winter light. Within 20 yards of the cabin, the shadows between the trees had taken on an unnatural quality, darker than they should be, like they were made of something heavier than mere absence of light. My radio hissed with static. I tried raising David and James again, but got only white noise in response. "Comms are down," I told Christopher, who nodded and adjusted his grip on his rifle. We moved deeper into the woods, each step taking us further from anything normal. The cold got worse, going through my tactical gear like it was just cotton. My breath came out in thick clouds that stuck around longer than they should before disappearing. Christopher raised his hand, telling me to stop. He pointed ahead, deeper into the forest where the pine trees grew so close together their branches connected. That's when I saw it. Between two huge pines, perfectly still and impossibly tall, stood a figure that made every nerve in my body scream danger. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more, but so thin it looked like a shadow that had somehow become real. The whole thing was black, not the black of clothing or skin, but the complete black of deep space, as if light just stopped existing around it. But the eyes, 2 points of white light that cut through the darkness between the trees, focused directly on me with a strength that made my chest tight. They didn't blink, didn't move, just stared with the kind of old evil that existed long before humans ever walked the earth. I tried to raise my rifle. My hands wouldn't work. My whole body had locked up, every muscle caught by a terror so deep it felt like drowning in ice water. This wasn't normal fear, the kind you get from enemy fire or dangerous missions. This was something basic, The sort of horror that reached into the deepest parts of your brain and whispered that you were prey. The thing didn't move, didn't make any sound. It just stood there between the trees, studying me with those burning white eyes, and I knew for certain that it was deciding whether or not to kill me. Time stretched into something weird and wrong. Seconds felt like hours while I stood frozen, unable to even breathe right. The static in my earpiece had become a low, steady pulse that seemed to match my heartbeat. Or maybe my heart was matching it. I needed to blink. My eyes were watering from the cold and the strain of staring, but some deep instinct warned me not to look away, not to give this thing even a moment where I couldn't see what it was doing. But finally, I had no choice. My eyes burned and closed for just an instant. When I opened them, the space between the trees was empty. "Mike," Christopher's voice cut through the static, close and urgent. "What happened? You just stopped moving." I realized I was shaking. Deep, uncontrollable tremors that had nothing to do with the cold. My rifle was still in my hands, pointed at the spot where the entity had been standing, though I had no memory of raising it. How long was I standing here? Maybe 30 seconds. You went rigid, then started shaking. I called out, but you didn't respond. Christopher's eyes swept the trees around us, alert for threats. "What did you see?" I opened my mouth to tell him, then stopped. How do you describe something like that? How do you explain the kind of fear that makes your body forget how to work? "We need to get back to the others. Now." Christopher didn't argue. We pushed through the forest toward where David and James had been conducting their sweep, my legs still unsteady. We found them about 50 yards from the cabin, both looking pale and shaken. David's radio was making the same rhythmic static that had filled my earpiece, while James was repeatedly checking his equipment with the kind of frantic attention that meant something had gone very wrong. "Please tell me you guys heard that too," David said when he saw us approaching. "Heard what?" "Like voices in the static. Couldn't make out words, but it sounded like..." He shook his head. "Never mind. Sounds crazy." James looked up from his radio. "My GPS went dead about 5 minutes ago. Compass is spinning like it can't find magnetic north. All my electronics are acting up." Christopher and I looked at each other. My own equipment had been acting up during our encounter, though I'd been too focused on the creature to pay much attention to it. "We're leaving," I said. "Pack everything up and head for the vehicles. Double time." None of them asked questions. Whatever they'd experienced during their sweep had been enough to make the order welcome. Within 10 minutes, we'd loaded our gear and Wexler's research materials into the truck, and were driving away from the cabin as fast as the rough terrain would allow. The drive to our pickup point normally would have taken 2 hours. I pushed it hard and made it in 90 minutes, but even that felt too long. Every shadow between the trees looked wrong. Every bend in the road felt like it might show something waiting for us. None of us spoke during the entire 6-hour drive to the airport. What was there to say? That we'd run into something that shouldn't exist? That a dead scientist's research about things from beyond the stars might actually be real? That whatever had been following Dr. Lee Wexler in his final days had now seen us too? Instead, we sat in silence, each lost in our own thoughts, while the Alaskan wilderness rolled past the windows and the static from our radios slowly went back to normal. The Nevada base stretched beneath what any passing aircraft would see as empty desert, its entrance hidden behind camouflaged blast doors that opened onto miles of underground corridors. Our unit occupied one wing of the facility, sharing space with other specialized teams that handled the kind of assignments regular military wasn't equipped for. I'd been stationed here for 3 years, and still didn't know what half the other units actually did. Walking through those known corridors after Alaska felt like stepping into someone else's life. The sterile white walls and buzzing fluorescent lights seemed too normal, too safe after what we'd encountered in Wexler's forest. David moved beside me with his usual easy stride, but I caught him looking at the ceiling-mounted security cameras more than usual. James kept checking his watch, and Christopher had barely spoken since we'd landed. The debriefing room was exactly what you'd expect. Conference table, uncomfortable chairs, and a wall-mounted screen that Bryant never seemed to use. I'd sat in this same room dozens of times before, usually getting chewed out for some tactical decision or procedural violation. This time felt different. This time I was walking in to explain how we'd failed to complete our primary objective because the target had killed himself before we'd arrived. Bryant was already waiting when we entered, reviewing a file that he closed as soon as we sat down. No small talk, no coffee offered. Standard operating procedure for mission debriefings. "Report," he said, looking directly at me. I laid out the facts in chronological order. Landing coordinates, approach to the cabin, discovery of Wexler's body, the scene inside with all the research materials and that bloody message on the wall. I kept my voice level and professional, sticking to what I could see, rather than impressions or theories. Bryant listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When I described finding Wexler hanging from the support beam, he nodded slightly, like he'd been expecting that particular detail. Same reaction when I mentioned the astronomical charts and the sketches of the tall figure with glowing eyes. "Any signs of foul play?" he asked when I'd finished describing the cabin's interior. "None. Suicide by hanging. Probably occurred 24 to 36 hours before we arrived. No defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. Door was unlocked when we found it." "What about his research materials?" "Extensive documentation of astronomical observations going back 5 years. Appears he was tracking something he believed was approaching Earth. Final entries suggest increasing paranoia and psychological deterioration." David moved in his chair. "Sir, with respect, some of that research was pretty advanced stuff. Mathematical equations I couldn't even begin to understand. Star charts marked with coordinates that didn't correspond to any visible objects." Bryant made another note. "Anything else of significance during your time at the location?" This was the moment I'd been dreading. The part where I had to decide whether to mention what I'd seen in the forest. In any normal debriefing, I would have reported the contact without hesitation, but something about Bryant's carefully neutral expression told me he was waiting for this specific piece of information. We conducted a perimeter sweep before extraction. During that operation, I observed an unidentified figure in the tree line approximately 60 yards from the cabin. Describe this figure. I chose my words carefully. Tall, thin, dark clothing or skin. Estimated height over 8 feet. Subject maintained visual contact for about 30 seconds before disappearing from view. Bryant set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "Did you attempt to make contact?" "Negative. Subject appeared hostile and potentially dangerous. Team executed tactical withdrawal to avoid engagement." "Good." Bryant's approval caught me off guard. "You made the right call leaving when you did." The comment hung in the air for several seconds. James cleared his throat and asked the question we were all thinking. "Sir, should we have expected to encounter hostile personnel at the target location?" "No," Bryant said, "but remote locations sometimes attract unusual individuals. Survivalists, paranoids, people trying to stay off the radar for various reasons. Best to avoid contact when possible." His explanation felt rehearsed, like he'd given this same answer before. The way he'd reacted to my report suggested he'd known exactly what kind of situation we might encounter at Wexler's cabin. which raised the obvious question of why he hadn't warned us beforehand. Your quick thinking likely prevented casualties, Bryant continued. Mission parameters called for live capture, but given the circumstances, you followed proper protocol. No criticism of your tactical decisions. I'd expected a reprimand for failing to complete the objective. Instead, Bryant was praising our performance. Either I was missing something important, or the colonel had been prepared for this outcome from the beginning. Sir, Christopher spoke up for the first time since we'd entered the room. What happens to all the research materials we recovered? They'll be processed by the appropriate personnel. Wexler had clearance for certain types of classified research before he dropped off the grid. Some of his work may still fall under national security protocols. Bryant dismissed David, James, and Christopher with standard post-mission instructions. Complete written reports within 24 hours. Remain available for follow-up questions. Standard medical evaluation within the week. But when they stood to leave, he motioned for me to stay behind. The door closed with a soft click, leaving us alone in the windowless room. Bryant pulled out a different file, thicker than the one he'd been reviewing earlier, and opened it on the table between us. From where I sat, I could see photographs clipped to the inside cover, aerial shots of Wexler's cabin, close-ups of the interior, and what looked like copies of some of his research drawings. How long have you been with this unit, Thompson?
3 years, 4 months. Good record. Clean efficiency ratings, no disciplinary issues, solid tactical instincts. He flipped through several pages. Your team trusts you, and you make smart decisions under pressure. Thank you, sir. That's why I'm going to give you some advice. Bryant closed the file and looked directly at me. What you saw in Alaska, the figure in the forest, forget about it. Don't research it. Don't discuss it with your teammates. Don't try to connect it to Wexler's death or his research. The words hit me like cold water. Sir, some investigations lead down paths that don't have good endings. Dr. Wexler spent 5 years following one of those paths, and you saw how it turned out for him. Bryant's voice remained calm and professional, but there was something underneath it that reminded me of the way people talked when they'd seen combat. Your job is to complete missions and bring your team home safely. Focus on that. Are you saying there's a connection between Wexler's death and what we encountered? I'm saying that asking those kinds of questions is a good way to end up like Wexler. Some things are better left buried, Thompson. He learned that too late. Bryant stood up, signaling the end of our conversation. But as I reached the door, he called my name. One more thing. If you or any of your teammates start experiencing unusual incidents, equipment malfunctions, communications problems, anything that seems out of the ordinary, report it immediately. Don't try to handle it on your own. I wanted to ask what kind of incidents he meant, but his expression made it clear the discussion was over. I saluted and left the room, walking back through those sterile corridors with more questions than I'd had before the debriefing. Over the next few days, the base felt different. Security patrols ran more frequently, and I started noticing personnel I didn't recognize conducting sweeps of areas that had never been restricted before. Electronic equipment got inspected twice daily instead of weekly. New cameras appeared in corridors that had never been monitored. My teammates seemed to sense the change too. During meals, David kept his usual jokes to a minimum and spent more time watching the exits. James triple-checked his gear before every routine training exercise. Christopher started wearing sunglasses indoors, claiming the fluorescent lights were giving him headaches. None of us talked about Alaska directly, but the conversations we didn't have felt heavier than the ones we did. When someone mentioned cold weather training, the discussion would die out quickly. If a news report showed astronomical footage, whoever was holding the remote would change the channel immediately. We went through our normal routines,
equipment maintenance, physical training, tactical exercises in the simulation rooms, but everything felt forced, like we were all pretending that nothing had changed. The problem was, something had changed. We'd seen things that didn't fit into the neat categories of standard military operations, and now we were being told to forget about it. I found myself checking shadows differently, paying attention to peripheral movement that might not be there. The rational part of my mind said it was normal post-mission stress, the kind of heightened awareness that comes after any dangerous assignment. But late at night, lying in my bunk listening to the base's mechanical systems buzzing through the walls, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd brought something back with us from Alaska, something that knew we'd seen it. I couldn't get Bryant's warning out of my head. Don't research it. Don't discuss it. Don't try to connect it. The advice made sense from a career preservation standpoint, but it left me staring at the ceiling of my quarters at 0300 hours, wide awake and thinking about those glowing white eyes in the forest. Sleep wasn't happening. I'd been trying for 3 hours, turning over every detail from Alaska until my brain felt like it was running in circles. The rational part of me said to follow orders, file the report, and move on to the next assignment. The part that had seen something impossible standing between those pine trees said I needed answers. The base operated on skeleton crew during night hours, which meant the computer terminals in the research wing would be empty. My clearance level gave me access to classified databases that regular personnel couldn't touch, including archives of personnel files and mission reports going back decades. If I was going to break Bryant's direct order, now was the time to do it. The corridors felt different at night. Emergency lighting cast everything in a dim red glow that made shadows look longer than they should. My footsteps repeated off the concrete walls no matter how hard I tried to move quietly. Twice I stopped and looked over my shoulder, certain I'd heard someone following me, but the hallway stayed empty. The research wing's main terminal required my security card and biometric scan. The system logged my access, which meant if anyone checked the records, they'd know exactly when I'd been here and what I'd looked at. But some things were worth the risk. I started with Lee Wexler's basic personnel file. The photograph showed a man in his 40s with keen, intelligent eyes and neatly trimmed graying hair. Nothing like the corpse we'd found hanging in that cabin. His academic credentials were impressive. PhD in astrophysics from MIT, published research in several prestigious journals, consulting work for NASA and the European Space Agency. The timeline showed a successful career right up until 5 years ago. Professor at Princeton, department head, respected member of the scientific community. Then suddenly, he'd resigned his position, liquidated his assets, and disappeared from academic life entirely. No explanation in his file, just a notation that he'd requested transfer to a classified research facility in Alaska. His last published paper, filed in the database 3 months before he went off-grid, caught my attention immediately. Unusual astronomical observations, evidence of non-gravitational movement in deep space objects. The abstract described dark objects moving between star systems without following known gravitational laws, accelerating and changing direction in ways that defied physics. The paper had been peer-reviewed but never published. Academic journals had rejected it, citing insufficient evidence and conclusions unsupported by observational data. Reading between the lines, his colleagues had thought he was losing his mind. I accessed the classified archives next, searching for the materials we'd recovered from Wexler's cabin. Everything was there: boxes of journals, research notes, astronomical charts, and those disturbing sketches. Someone had digitized the contents, making them searchable through the database. Wexler's personal files painted a picture of a brilliant man slowly descending into obsession. His early entries from Alaska showed excitement about the isolation and perfect conditions for astronomical observation. He'd installed professional-grade equipment and was tracking objects that mainstream astronomy couldn't detect. But around year 3, the tone changed. He began documenting things that made my chest tighten, just reading about them. Objects that appeared in his telescope but vanished when he tried to photograph them. Shadows moving independently of any light source. Equipment failures that happened with precise timing, always when he was closest to documenting something significant. His research became focused on a single entity that he believed was traveling toward Earth. Page after page of calculations, trajectory analysis, and observational data tracking something massive moving through deep space. According to his notes, this thing had been approaching our solar system for decades, following a path that suggested intelligence rather than random drift. The historical research was worse. Wexler had spent months collecting accounts from different cultures and time periods, all describing encounters with tall, dark figures that brought death and destruction. Cave paintings from France showing elongated black shapes standing over human bodies. Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories about shadow spirits that devoured entire tribes. Medieval European accounts of plague years that began with sightings of the Dark One walking between villages. Every culture had different names for it, but the description stayed consistent across thousands of years and continents. A creature of impossible height and thinness, eyes that burned with white light, and an ability to appear and disappear without warning. In every account, its arrival came before mass death events, plagues, famines, wars that wiped out populations. Wexler's final entries, dated just days before his suicide, were barely coherent. His handwriting had gotten worse into frantic scrawls, and the content read like the ravings of someone on the edge of complete mental breakdown. But buried in the paranoid rambling were calculations that made my blood run cold. He'd tracked the entity's approach with scientific precision, plotting its course through astronomical observation and mathematical analysis. According to his data, it had entered Earth's atmospheric influence 3 days before his death. The timing matched perfectly with when we'd found his body. Most disturbing were his notes about the creature's hunting behavior. Wexler believed it could follow those who had seen it, marking them somehow for future encounters. He described feeling watched constantly during his final weeks, finding evidence of something moving around his cabin at night, and experiencing equipment failures that seemed designed to prevent him from documenting its presence. His last coherent entry was a warning. It knows when it's been seen. The act of observation creates a connection that can't be broken. Those who witness it become targets, marked for collection when it's ready to feed. I should have stopped looking when I had the chance. I leaned back in my chair, processing what I'd just read. If Wexler was right, if this thing could somehow track people who had seen it, then my encounter in the Alaska forest had been more than just a chance sighting. It had been a targeting event. The base's ventilation system buzzed quietly around me, the only sound in the empty research wing. I checked the time. 04:37. I'd been reading for over an hour, completely absorbed in Wexler's documentation of something that shouldn't exist. I was reaching for the keyboard to close the files when the lights flickered. Just for a second, the steady fluorescent lighting wavered, casting the room into brief darkness before returning to normal. The computer screen went black for the same instant, then flickered back to life. But instead of Wexler's research files, 2 words appeared in white text against a black background. "It is here." My hands froze above the keyboard. The message stayed on screen for maybe 3 seconds before the system returned to normal, displaying the database interface as if nothing had happened. But I'd seen it. Those same words that Wexler had written in blood on his cabin wall. The lights flickered again, longer this time, and the ventilation system's buzz changed pitch for just a moment before returning to its normal rhythm. I closed the files, logged out of the system, and sat in the empty research wing staring at the blank screen. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of this room and find other people. Safety in numbers. But my legs felt heavy, unwilling to move. The entity knew I'd been researching it. Somehow, it was aware that I'd connected the dots between Wexler's death and my sighting in Alaska. Just like Wexler had written in his final entries, the act of observation created a connection that couldn't be broken. I was marked now, and according to everything I'd just read, that meant it was coming for me. I was still staring at the blank computer screen when the alarm started. The sound cut through the research wing, sharp, loud blasts that meant the base was under attack. Emergency protocols kicked in automatically, sealing blast doors and turning on defensive systems throughout the facility. I'd heard these alarms during drills, but never at 4:30 in the morning, never with the urgent, panicked edge that meant this wasn't practice. Red emergency lighting flooded the corridors as I ran toward my quarters to grab my weapon. The normal fluorescent fixtures had shut down, leaving everything covered in red light that turned known walls into something weird and threatening. Soldiers poured out of barracks and duty stations, most half-dressed, but moving with trained efficiency toward their assigned emergency positions. But something was wrong with their movements. Instead of the controlled urgency I'd seen in real crisis situations, these men were running with real terror. Voices carried over the alarm system, shouting, orders that made no sense, and underneath it all, sounds I couldn't identify. Metallic screeching, like steel being torn apart, and deeper noises that made my chest vibrate. I reached my quarters and grabbed my M4 from the wall locker, checking the magazine and chamber automatically. Whatever had broken through our defenses, I'd face it with proper equipment. The armory was 3 corridors away, where I could get additional ammunition and link up with other personnel. But as I moved through the emergency-lit hallways, the sounds of combat grew closer. Not the controlled bursts of disciplined fire, but desperate, random shooting mixed with screaming. I turned the corner toward the main corridor and stopped dead. David was lying on the floor 20 feet ahead of me, his body twisted at an impossible angle. Even in the red lighting, I could see the massive wounds across his chest and arms, tears in his flesh that looked like something had literally pulled him apart with surgical precision. No blast pattern, no bullet holes, nothing that matched any weapon I'd ever seen used in combat. Blood pooled around his body, far more than should have been possible given the wounds. The metallic smell filled the corridor, thick enough to taste. David's eyes stared at the ceiling, wide with the same terror I'd seen in Wexler's face back in Alaska. More gunfire came from the direction of the command center, followed by a scream that cut off suddenly. I keyed my radio, trying to establish contact with anyone who might coordinate a response, but got only static mixed with sounds that definitely weren't human voices. Moving past David's body, I forced myself to maintain tactical awareness. Check corners, watch for movement, keep the weapon ready. But every shadow seemed wrong under the emergency lighting, stretching and moving in ways that made me question what I was actually seeing. The main corridor ahead led directly to the command center, where backup systems and communication equipment could help establish what kind of threat we were facing. I moved carefully, using doorways for cover, listening for any indication of friendly forces organizing a defense. That's when I found James. He was slumped against the wall near the security checkpoint, his rifle still in his hands, but his body bearing the same impossible wounds I'd seen on David. Deep tears through his tactical vest and the flesh beneath, precise and clean like something with razor-sharp claws, had methodically dissected him. His expression showed the same wide-eyed terror, as if he'd seen something that broke his mind before it killed his body. Christopher was 10 feet further down the hall, face down in a spreading pool of blood. I didn't need to check for vital signs. The state of his body made survival impossible. Whatever had killed my teammates had done it with inhuman strength and precision, tearing through military-trained soldiers like they were defenseless. The radio static in my earpiece suddenly changed, developing that same rhythmic pulse I remembered from Alaska. The sound made my skin crawl, bringing back memories of those white eyes in the forest and the paralyzing fear that had left me helpless. I reached the intersection leading to the command center and stopped to check around the corner. The corridor ahead was empty, except for emergency lighting casting those moving red shadows. But at the far end, maybe 60 feet away, something moved. It stepped out from across corridor and stood facing me directly, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. The thing from Alaska, but now fully visible under the base's emergency systems instead of hidden between dark trees. Over 8 feet tall, just as I remembered, but seeing it clearly made the forest encounter seem like a gentle introduction. Its shape was wrong in ways that hurt to look at directly. Stretched limbs that bent at joints humans didn't have, proportions that suggested it had been stretched by some cosmic torture device. The black surface of its body didn't reflect any light from the emergency fixtures. Instead, it seemed to absorb light like a living void, creating an absence of reality in the middle of the corridor. Blood covered its arms and hands, fresh enough to still be flowing. My teammate's blood. The white eyes burned with that same old malevolence, but now they held something else. Recognition, satisfaction. Like it had finally cornered prey it had been hunting for a long time. When it spoke, the voice that came from its impossible throat was Lee Wexler's. "You brought me here, soldier. You opened the door." The words hit me hard. Wexler's voice, exactly as I remembered it from the recordings we'd found, but coming from this creature that had killed him, and now stood in my base, surrounded by the bodies of my friends. The message was clear. By researching his files, by connecting the dots he'd laid out in his final entries, I had somehow given this thing the ability to follow me here. I raised my rifle and fired. The M4 kicked against my shoulder as I emptied the entire 30-round magazine into the creature's center mass. Controlled bursts, proper sight picture, all the training taking over. In that narrow corridor, at 60 feet, every shot should have connected, but the bullets passed through it like it was made of smoke. No impact, no reaction, nothing to show I was even firing at something solid. The creature didn't move or react. It just stood there watching me waste ammunition on a target that couldn't be hurt by conventional weapons. The empty magazine hit the floor, and I instinctively reached for a spare before realizing how pointless that would be. The thing began moving toward me, with that same impossible silence I remembered from Alaska, covering distance without seeming to take actual steps. That freezing terror from the forest returned, washing over me and locking my muscles in place. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body refused to respond. The creature approached steadily, those burning white eyes fixed on mine. 10 feet away. 5 feet. I could smell ozone and something else, the sharp scent of electrical discharge mixed with decay. Its long hand reached toward my face, fingers that ended in points rather than nails extending to touch my skin. Then it was gone. Between one heartbeat and the next, the corridor was empty. No sound, no movement, just the steady pulse of the alarm system and my own ragged breathing bouncing off the walls. The smell of ozone hung around for several seconds before fading, leaving only the metallic odor of blood from my teammates' bodies. Backup power systems kicked in with a mechanical buzz, bringing additional lighting online and restoring some normality to the facility's operations. Emergency protocols continued running automatically, blast doors cycling, communication systems attempting to re-establish contact with external command. damage assessment routines, checking the integrity of critical systems. Footsteps approached from behind me, and I turned to see other survivors coming out from wherever they'd taken shelter during the attack. Personnel from different units, all looking as shaken and confused as I felt. Someone was shouting orders about casualty reports and perimeter security, trying to impose military discipline on a situation that had moved far beyond normal operational parameters. But I barely heard them. I was thinking about Wexler's final warning, about the creature's words in the dead scientist's voice, and about the cold certainty that this was far from over. I had opened the door just like it said, and now it knew exactly where to find me. The questioning started within the first hour. Military personnel I'd never seen before moved through the base with practiced efficiency, interviewing survivors and taking statements about what had happened during the attack. They wore standard fatigues without unit patches, and their questions followed a very specific script, focused on gas leaks, equipment malfunctions, and confusion rather than what we'd actually seen. I sat in a temporary holding area with 12 other survivors, all of us looking shell-shocked and trying to process what we'd been through. The official story was already taking shape around us. Someone mentioned seeing unusual readings from the ventilation system. Another person talked about feeling dizzy and disoriented before the alarm started. Each account was carefully recorded and filed away. By the third hour, heavy transport vehicles had arrived at the base. Cleanup crews in hazmat suits began removing bodies and sanitizing affected areas. I watched through a small window as they loaded my teammates into body bags with the same clinical detachment they'd use for contaminated equipment. No military honors, no recognition of their service, just efficient disposal of inconvenient evidence. The lockdown continued for 18 hours. Nobody entered or left the facility without authorization from the external command team that had taken control of operations. Communication with the outside world was completely cut off, and our personal devices had been taken away for security analysis. When Colonel Bryant finally called me to his temporary office, I'd been awake for almost 36 hours straight. The man who sat across from me looked tired but determined, with a stack of files and forms arranged precisely on the desk between us. He'd traded his usual commanding presence for something more bureaucratic, like he was processing paperwork rather than covering up mass murder. "Thompson, I need you to review this incident report and provide your signature," he said, sliding a folder toward me. "Standard procedure after any facility emergency." I opened the file and read the official account of what had happened. According to the report, a breakdown in the base's air systems had released an unknown chemical compound into the ventilation network. Personnel exposed to the gas experienced severe hallucinations, confusion, and paranoid behavior that led to friendly fire incidents. David Rodriguez, James Wilson, and Christopher Lee had died from gunshot wounds during the resulting panic and chaos. The document was thorough, complete with technical details about ventilation failures and toxicology reports showing chemical residue in the victims' bloodstreams. Someone had spent significant time and resources creating a believable alternative explanation for what had happened. "This isn't what happened," I said, looking up from the pages. Bryant leaned back in his chair and looked at me with cold eyes. "Thompson, you've been through a traumatic experience. Exposure to hallucinogenic compounds can create extremely vivid and disturbing false memories. The human brain isn't built to process certain types of chemical interference, and it fills in gaps with imagery that seems completely real. I saw something kill my teammates, something that shouldn't exist. You saw your teammates die during a panic situation caused by chemical exposure. Your mind created additional details to make sense of trauma that otherwise defied explanation." His voice remained calm and professional, like he'd given this speech many times before. The alternative would be accepting that some kind of supernatural entity breached a secured military facility and committed multiple homicides,
without leaving any physical evidence. Which explanation seems more rational? I stared at the report, knowing he was right about one thing. My account sounded insane when stripped of context and emotional impact. A tall, dark figure with glowing eyes that spoke in a dead man's voice and disappeared when shot at. No physical evidence, no way to prove what I'd witnessed. Your teammates' bodies show clear ballistic trauma consistent with friendly fire incidents, Bryant continued. The base's security system recorded multiple personnel discharging weapons in confined spaces during the emergency. Forensic analysis confirms that the fatal wounds came from standard military ammunition fired by base personnel. That detail hit me harder than I'd expected. If the creature left no physical marks, then someone else had actually shot David, James, and Christopher. The entity had somehow manipulated the situation to turn survivors against each other while remaining completely untouchable. Bryant slid a pen across the desk. Sign the report, Thompson. Accept the psychological counseling we're arranging for you. Process this experience through proper medical channels instead of dwelling on impossible explanations. And if I refuse?
His expression got a little harder. Talking about classified operational details with unauthorized personnel is a federal crime. Spreading false information about military incidents can be prosecuted as treason, especially during wartime. But more importantly, talking about things that didn't happen makes you sound unstable, which raises questions about your fitness for continued service. The threat was clear enough. Sign the report and accept their version of events, or face court-martial and prison time for discussing what had really happened. Either way, the truth would be buried under layers of official documentation and medical diagnoses. I picked up the pen and signed my name at the bottom of the incident report. Good decision, Bryant said, collecting the paperwork and adding it to his files. You'll be transferred to temporary quarters while we arrange your psychological evaluation and extended leave. Dr. Martinez will handle your case. She specializes in trauma recovery for personnel who've experienced unusual stress situations. Over the following weeks, the systematic breakdown of our team became obvious. The surviving members were quietly moved to different units across multiple bases, making sure none of us would be stationed together again. When I asked about contacting them, I was told that discussing the incident with other survivors could mess with our individual recovery processes. Dr. Martinez was a competent psychiatrist who approached my case with predetermined conclusions. During our sessions, she guided me toward accepting the chemical exposure explanation while dismissing my actual memories as stress-induced hallucinations. The diagnosis was already written before I walked into her office. Combat fatigue made worse by toxin exposure, requiring extended treatment and possible medical discharge. The sessions followed a predictable pattern. She'd ask about my memories of the incident, listen patiently as I described what I'd witnessed, then explain how trauma and chemical interference could create false experiences that seemed completely real. Over time, she stopped asking about my memories and focused instead on helping me accept the official version of events. 6 months of treatment, psychological evaluation, and administrative processing later, I was granted extended medical leave with full benefits. The paperwork classified me as temporarily unfit for active duty due to stress-related disorders. But everyone understood the real message. I was being quietly pushed out of military service because I couldn't accept the official story. During one of my final sessions with Dr. Martinez, she mentioned something that stayed with me long after I left her office. When I asked about other personnel who'd experienced similar chemical exposure incidents, she paused for just a moment before saying that the military had dealt with environmental contamination events before and had developed effective protocols for helping survivors process their experiences. The way she said it, carefully like she was repeating approved language, made it clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. The government had procedures in place for situations exactly like ours, which meant they'd happened before, multiple times, based on how smoothly the cover-up had operated. Bryant had been ready with explanations, documentation, and personnel transfers within hours of the attack. The cleanup crews had known exactly what to look for and how to sanitize the scene. Dr. Martinez had a treatment plan designed specifically for people who'd witnessed things that officially didn't exist. All of it pointed to one disturbing conclusion. The entity that had killed my teammates wasn't unknown to military leadership. They'd encountered it before, possibly many times, and had developed institutional knowledge about how to contain information about its existence. Months after my discharge, I found myself living in a small apartment outside Denver, supposedly recovering from combat stress while drawing disability payments. The official story was that I'd suffered a psychological breakdown following exposure to hallucinogenic chemicals during a training accident at a classified facility. But recovery was impossible when I knew the truth was still out there. I started paying attention to patterns in news reports, looking for incidents that might indicate the entity's presence in other locations. Missing persons cases, where people vanished without explanation. Mass casualty events blamed on equipment failures or chemical accidents. Military personnel moved suddenly after reporting unusual experiences. The connections were subtle, but they existed. Every few months, somewhere in the country, people died under circumstances that didn't quite make sense according to official reports. Industrial accidents with impossible failure patterns. Research facilities shutting down after personnel accidents. Scientists and astronomers who disappeared or committed suicide after making specific types of discoveries. I began documenting everything I could remember from our mission in Alaska and the attack on the Nevada base. Not for any official purpose. I knew better than to think anyone in authority would listen, but as a record for anyone else who might encounter the same thing. Writing it down forced me to confront details I'd tried to forget. Wexler's research showing the entity had been traveling toward Earth for decades. His warning that observation created a connection that couldn't be broken. The creature's words in the scientist's voice, telling me I'd open the door by investigating his files. Most disturbing was the realization that everything had followed a predictable pattern. Wexler had tracked the entity's approach through astronomical observation, becoming increasingly obsessed until it finally reached him. I had researched his findings and made the same connections, drawing its attention to our base. Both of us had been marked by our curiosity about something we should have left alone. The entity fed on investigation itself. People who looked too closely, who asked too many questions, who connected dots that should have remained separate. We became targets simply by trying to understand what we'd encountered. Knowledge was the bait, and once you took it, you were hooked permanently. I've been living with that knowledge for 8 months now, looking around crowds and checking shadows, out of habit more than conscious fear. The creature is still out there, and according to everything I learned from Wexler's research, it knows exactly where to find me when it's ready. But maybe that's why I'm writing this down. Not because I think I can escape, or because anyone will believe what I'm saying, but because someone else might encounter the same warnings Wexler tried to leave behind. Someone might read this and recognize the signs before it's too late for them. If you ever hear someone say it is here, don't investigate. Don't research what they meant or try to understand the context. Don't follow up on unusual deaths or disappearances that seem connected to astronomical research or remote scientific outposts. Just run. The entity feeds on curiosity and marks those who seek it out. Once it knows you exist, once you've seen it or investigated its presence, it will eventually find you again. Distance doesn't matter, time doesn't matter, and there's no protection that conventional means can provide. I opened the door by trying to understand what killed Lee Wexler. Now I'm living with the consequences, waiting for something that could arrive tonight or next year or sometime in between. But at least I can leave this warning for anyone else who might be tempted to look where they shouldn't. Don't make the same mistake I did. Some doors should stay closed forever.